They didn't warn you about this part. Nobody sits you down and tells you that some seasons of your life will feel less like growth and more like demolition, that there will be mornings where you wake up and the weight of everything you've lost sits on your chest before you've even opened your eyes, that there will be moments where you look at the person staring back at you in the mirror and feel like a stranger is looking back. You were not supposed to end up here. That's what makes it so disorienting. You followed the rules. You worked hard. You showed up when others disappeared. You gave pieces of yourself to people, to dreams, to a version of the future you had constructed so carefully inside your mind. And then, without ceremony, without warning, without even the dignity of a proper ending, it fell apart. Maybe it was a relationship you poured years into, something you thought was permanent, something that had become so woven into your identity that when it ended, you didn't just lose a person, you lost the version of yourself that existed inside that connection. Maybe it was a career, a business, an opportunity you sacrificed sleep and comfort and time for, only to watch it collapse in ways you never anticipated, leaving you standing in the rubble, wondering what you missed, what you did wrong, whether you were ever as capable as you thought you were. Maybe it wasn't one dramatic failure. Maybe it was accumulation, a slow erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that happens through small moments, a door quietly closing here, a trust quietly breaking there, a dream quietly shrinking until one day you look up and realize the life you are living has almost nothing in common with the life you once imagined for yourself. That is a particular kind of pain. The kind with no clean origin point. The kind you can't fully explain to other people because there was no single catastrophe, just a long, quiet surrender that happened so gradually you didn't even feel yourself making it. And here you are now, somewhere between who you were before and who you have not yet become. Not fully broken, not fully rebuilt, just standing in that uncomfortable in-between place where the old version of you no longer fits and the new version hasn't taken shape yet. Most people will not tell you what that place actually means. They will offer you comfort. They will tell you it gets better. They will remind you of your worth in voices so gentle and so careful that the words slide off you without landing. Because comfort is not what that place requires. What that place requires is truth. Cold, uncomfortable, clarifying truth. Machiavelli understood something about failure that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. He understood that failure is not the opposite of power. It is, in fact, the beginning of it. Not the comfortable kind of power that comes from good fortune and easy circumstance, but the deep, immovable, unshakable kind that can only be forged through the experience of losing, surviving, and refusing to misread what the loss was actually trying to teach you. He did not theorize from comfort. He did not write from a position of safety. His most enduring work was born from exile, from humiliation, from watching everything he had built and everything he had served get stripped from him in a single, merciless turn of political fate. And instead of collapsing into bitterness, instead of softening the lesson to protect his ego, he did something almost no one has the courage to do. He looked directly at what happened without flinching. He asked not just what the world had done to him, but what the experience was revealing about the nature of things, about human beings, about power, and about himself. That is the difference between a man who fails and stays broken, and a man who fails and becomes something the world was not prepared for. The first man treats failure as a verdict. The second man treats it as a map. What follows are not motivational promises. They are not gentle reassurances designed to make you feel better before you go back to sleep. They are 7 lessons drawn from the hardest moments a human being can move through, lessons that only reveal themselves fully when you have been taken apart far enough to finally see what you are actually made of underneath everything that was comfortable and familiar and safe. These lessons will not all feel good. Some of them will feel like a second blow landing, exactly where you are still bruised. But that is precisely how you know they are real. The truth that changes your life almost never feels like relief when you first encounter it. It usually feels like confrontation. So let this be a confrontation. Let this be the thing that reaches through your exhaustion and your doubt and your carefully maintained appearance of being fine, and says what the people around you are too afraid to say, what you have been too afraid to hear. Failure did not come to end you, it came to instruct you, but only if you are willing to sit still long enough to receive what it is actually carrying. Lesson 1. Pain is not the problem. Your relationship with pain is. There is a particular lie that gets repeated so often in the language of resilience and self-improvement that most people have stopped noticing it is a lie. The lie sounds like this: strong people don't let pain stop them. And hidden inside that sentence is an assumption so destructive that it has quietly undermined more men and women than any external failure ever could. The assumption is that pain is something to be overcome as quickly as possible. That your job when you encounter it is to push through it, suppress it, reframe it, and return to functioning as fast as your willpower allows. That assumption will keep you trapped, not because strength is wrong, but because the approach confuses movement with progress. A man who stuffs his pain down and keeps moving is not healing. He is accumulating. He is building pressure without a release valve. He is teaching his nervous system that the correct response to being hurt is to perform as if the hurt didn't happen. And that lesson has consequences. It creates men who are efficient on the surface and quietly disintegrating underneath. Men who keep achieving, keep producing, keep showing up, while something essential inside them gets harder and more brittle with every passing season, until eventually something small cracks it open and everyone around them is surprised by how much was being held in. Machiavelli did not look away from pain. He looked directly into it and asked what it was revealing, because that is what pain actually is. Not punishment. Not evidence that you made wrong choices or that the universe has turned against you. Pain is information. It is the most honest feedback system available to a human being, precisely because it cannot be politely managed the way other signals can. When someone respects you out of obligation, they can mask it. When someone has stopped believing in you, they can perform belief long enough to protect the relationship. When circumstances are moving against you, there is often a delay before the evidence becomes undeniable. But pain does not perform. Pain does not wait for a convenient moment. Pain arrives exactly when the thing it is pointing to becomes impossible to avoid. So the question a man in failure needs to ask is not, how do I stop this from hurting? The question is, what is this pain specifically exposing about the structure I built my confidence on, my identity on, my sense of safety on? Because pain is always pointing somewhere. It is always illuminating a dependency you did not know was controlling you, an illusion you had become too comfortable inside, a version of yourself that required conditions the world was never obligated to maintain. You gave your sense of worth to someone else to hold and called it love. You made your confidence dependent on external validation and called it ambition. You built your identity around a role, a relationship, a result, and told yourself that was simply caring deeply. And as long as the conditions held, you never had to confront how fragile the foundation actually was. Pain came and removed the conditions. And what you are feeling now is not just the loss of the thing itself, it is the exposure of how much weight you had placed on something that was never guaranteed to stay. That is not a comfortable realization, but it is a necessary one. Because until you see it clearly, you will simply rebuild the same structure with different materials and wonder why the same collapse keeps finding you under different names and faces and circumstances. The men who become genuinely difficult to break are not the ones who felt less. They are not the ones who cared less or trusted less or invested less of themselves. They are the ones who went through the pain honestly enough to understand what it was showing them, and then made the internal adjustments that pain was demanding. They rebuilt their foundation. Not on the presence of specific people or the achievement of specific outcomes, but on something internal, something that cannot be revoked by another person's decision, something that belongs entirely to them regardless of what the world does or does not offer. That is what this lesson is actually asking you to build. Not numbness, not detachment, not the hollow performance of someone who has decided never to care again because caring once cost them too much. It is asking you to feel the pain fully, trace it back to what it is exposing, and then do the painstaking work of rebuilding your foundation somewhere the world cannot reach as easily. Because the next time life hits, and it will hit, the question is not whether you will feel it. The question is whether what you are standing on will hold. Lesson 2. Silence is not weakness. It is the most misunderstood form of power. After a man has been broken, there is a pull so strong it can feel almost physical. A pull toward explanation, toward justification, toward finding the right words in the right order that will finally make the person who hurt you understand what they did. That will finally make the people who doubted you see that they were wrong. That will finally close the gap between how you know yourself to be and how you were treated. You have felt that pull. You have rewritten a message so many times the original version no longer exists. You have rehearsed a conversation in your head while lying awake at 3 a.m, constructing the perfect argument, anticipating every response, arranging your truth so precisely and so thoroughly that surely, when you finally say it, something will shift. It rarely shifts. And the reason it rarely shifts is not because your words were wrong or your argument was flawed. It is because explanation directed at the wrong audience is not communication. It is audition. And every time you audition for someone who has already made their decision about you, you are not closing a wound. You are reopening it and handing them the instrument. Machiavelli understood something about words that most people spend their whole lives learning too late. He understood that words are not neutral. Every word you speak reveals something about your internal state. Every explanation you offer reveals what you need the other person to believe about you. Every justification you produce reveals the gap between how you see yourself and how you fear you are being seen. And the people who do not wish you well are not listening to your words to understand you. They are listening to find the places where the armor is thin. There is a kind of silence that is not avoidance. It is not passivity. It is not the silence of someone who has given up or run out of things to say. It is the silence of someone who has made a deliberate calculation about where their energy belongs. Someone who has looked at the situation clearly enough to understand that some audiences are not owed a performance, that some conversations will never produce the closure they promise, that some people have made up their minds, and the greatest power available to you in that moment is the power of withholding. Not withholding out of pettiness, not withholding to punish, withholding because you have finally understood that your inner world is not a public resource, that your pain is not content for people who contributed to it, that your plans are not previews for people who would benefit from knowing them before they are executed, that your vulnerability is not something to be distributed freely simply because you are in pain, and pain creates pressure to release. The men who move through the world with genuine authority are not the ones who say the most. They are the ones whose silence you cannot read. The ones who make you uncertain whether they are troubled or at peace, whether they noticed what just happened, or whether they are operating on a level of information you don't have access to. That uncertainty is not manufactured. It is the natural byproduct of a man who has stopped seeking permission from his environment to feel settled inside himself. This is the practice. When the urge to explain arrives, and it will arrive, you ask yourself one question before you open your mouth or unlock your phone. Who is this for? If the honest answer is that it is for you, that you need to say it because the pressure of holding it is becoming unbearable, then find a different container for it. Write it. Say it to someone who has earned that level of access to your interior. Process it somewhere that does not hand your vulnerability to people who are not equipped or inclined to handle it with care. But if the honest answer is that you are explaining yourself to someone who no longer deserves the explanation, that you are justifying yourself to an audience that has already rendered a verdict, that you are performing your worth for people who decided your worth long before this conversation began, then close your mouth. Not forever, not out of pride, but because silence in that moment is not the absence of power, it is power in its most concentrated form. Lesson 3. The version of you that needs to be liked is slowly killing the version of you that needs to lead. There is something that happens to sensitive, intelligent, self-aware people when they are young that follows them for decades if they never name it. They learn usually through small but repeated experiences, that being liked creates safety. That approval is a form of protection. That if you can make enough people comfortable enough in your presence, if you can read the room accurately enough and adjust accordingly, if you can be agreeable and accommodating and careful never to take up too much space, the world becomes a less dangerous place. And for a while, that works. It works well enough that it hardens into strategy, then into identity. The person who never quite says the thing that might create friction. The person who absorbs tension rather than creating it. The person who reshapes their opinions slightly depending on who is in the room. The person who has become so skilled at reflecting back what others want to see that they have gradually lost track of what they actually think, what they actually want, who they actually are beneath all the careful adjustments. That person often mistakes their own agreeableness for kindness, their accommodation for generosity, their approval seeking for emotional intelligence. And in some lights, it can look like all of those things. But underneath it is something much simpler and much more costly. It is fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of conflict. Fear of the space that opens up when you say what you actually mean and the other person decides they don't like it. Machiavelli was not popular in his time. He was not popular because he refused to say what powerful men wanted to hear. He looked at the way power actually operated, stripped away the comforting stories people told themselves about justice and merit and the natural rewards of virtue, and wrote down what he actually observed. That cost him almost everything in the short term, and it made him immortal in the long one. The version of you that needs to be liked will never build anything that lasts, not because likability is wrong, but because the decisions that lead to a meaningful life are almost never the decisions that maximize approval in the moment. They are the decisions that align with something deeper than the social temperature of the room. And to make those decisions consistently, you have to be willing to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood, disagreed with, criticized, and occasionally, deliberately excluded. That discomfort does not go away. The men who have learned to lead themselves and others through it are not men who stopped feeling the sting of disapproval. They are men who stopped letting that sting determine their next move. Because here is what the approval-seeking version of you has never fully calculated. The people who respect you most in the long run are almost never the people you are most careful not to upset. They are the people who watched you say the true thing when the easier thing was available, who saw you hold a position under pressure when collapsing would have been forgiven, who noticed that you were the same person in the room as you were outside of it. That consistency, that coherence between who you are privately and who you present publicly, is not just a moral virtue. It is a form of power that cannot be faked and cannot be taken, because it is not built on what people think of you. It is built on what you know about yourself. And the moment your sense of self stops, depending on the verdict of the room, something changes in the way you move through the world that other people feel before they can articulate what is different. Lesson 4. Betrayal is expensive, but what it buys you is irreplaceable. There is a particular kind of wound that does not come from enemies. It does not come from strangers or competitors or people who are openly against you from the beginning. Those wounds, as painful as they are, carry a kind of clean logic. You knew the terrain was hostile. You understood the opposition. The injury makes sense within the architecture of the situation. The wound that changes a man at a fundamental level is the one that comes from someone he trusted. Someone he opened a door for that he kept closed for most people. Someone who knew the version of him that existed before the performance, before the armor, before the careful management of how much of himself he allowed the world to see. When that person becomes the source of the damage, something more than hurt occurs. Something in the way you process trust itself gets altered. Not just the specific trust you had for that specific person, but your entire internal model of what other people are capable of, what safety actually means, how much of yourself it is ever wise to make available to another human being. Most people respond to that alteration in one of two ways. The first response is to shut down completely. To conclude that openness was the mistake, that vulnerability was a strategic error, that the lesson of betrayal is to become inaccessible, to build walls high enough that no one can ever again get close enough to cause that kind of damage. The second response is the opposite: to minimize what happened, to rationalize the other person's behavior in ways that allow you to return to the same level of openness almost immediately, because the alternative, genuinely reckoning with what the experience revealed, is too uncomfortable to sit with for long. Both responses are forms of avoidance. And Machiavelli would have recognized both of them as the reactions of a man who has not yet extracted the actual lesson hiding inside the experience. Because betrayal, looked at with clear eyes and without the distortion of either bitterness or denial, is not primarily a statement about the person who betrayed you. It is a statement about information. Specifically, it is evidence that somewhere in your assessment of that person, in your reading of that relationship, in your understanding of the incentives and values and character that were actually operating beneath the surface, there was a gap, a place where what you believed did not match what was real. That gap is where the lesson lives, not the lesson that people are fundamentally untrustworthy, not the lesson that closeness is inherently dangerous. The lesson is much more precise and much more useful than either of those broad conclusions.